Hi, I'm retired NYPD Detective Vic Ferrari, and welcome to NYPD Through the Looking Glass podcast, where you'll get unique insight into the New York City Police Department. Before we get started, I encourage you to check out my Amazon author page, where you'll find my series of behind-the-scenes NYPD books. They're $10 paperback, $2.99 ebook download, including NYPD Presumption and Dysfunction. I hope everyone had a happy and safe New Year's Eve last night and enjoying New Year's Day. Not everyone did in this country, unfortunately. So before we get started with this week's story, let's jump to the New York Post true crime section. At least 10 people were killed and dozens injured after a terrorist rammed a truck into a crowd on the famed Bourbon Street, New Orleans, before jumping out and shooting at cops just hours after the city rang in the new year. The unidentified driver, who is now identified, who police said was hell-bent on carnage, was shot and killed in a gun battle with cops. So I'm watching this thing this morning, and the first thing that I notice, a few hours after the incident, we have an FBI spokesperson with a nose ring telling us that it was an incident and not a terrorist attack, despite mowing down at least 45 people in a crowd with a pickup truck that what looks like an ISIS flag, a black flag hanging from the back of the truck, which someone wrapped like a jacket around after the incident. Then after this guy is done running down people, he shoots it out with the cops. He's found to be in possession of numerous explosive devices, and that the FBI was going to be taking the lead in investigation. But it's not a terrorist attack. Oh, yeah, and the guy was in military fatigues, and he had a beard, but there's nothing to see here. But probably about noon, the FBI changed it. I went on their website, and now they are investigating it as a terrorist attack. They also think that there was a cell. He's involved with more than several people, and it's quite possible that these people have placed IED explosive devices around Bourbon Street in New Orleans. The killer's been identified as Shamsud Din Jabbar. He's reported to be a 42-year-old American citizen born and raised in Texas, who formerly served in the U.S. Army. Just before so it's funny when after you have an incident like this, everybody wants to rush up. It's like the NYPD. Everybody wants to rush up to the podium and start pounding their chest and look what I'm doing. And Louisiana State Senator John Kennedy, known for his one-liners, and he's actually quite funny. He must be up for re-election. He's now threatening to raise holy hell on federal agencies investigating this case if they aren't honest with the American public. I like John Kennedy, and I think he's funny, but he tends to talk the talk and not walk the walk. So we'll see what's going on with this. But like I said, the FBI now, it looks like it's a big investigation. It looks like there's more people involved with this guy. I actually, once his name was released, I started Googling him and researching him. There's a video of him. He's actually a realtor, I think, was a realtor in the Houston area. And he's got this YouTube video. And he's sitting there explaining that his house closings always go without a hitch. Everything's signed. Everything's documented. How pleased you're going to be with this guy if you buy a house with him, and how his house closings are they go off without a hitch. Listen, I've had 2 house closings, okay? And the one thing I know with a house closing, someone forgets to sign something. The check they asked you to write for them isn't the same amount, and someone dropped the ball. So he was full of shit back then. And another thing with these house closings and stuff, everybody's got their hands out, and no one tends to do their job. So we're gonna follow up with this later on. If there's any additional information, I'll try to get to it. Now you got a second what looks like a terrorist attack in Las Vegas that happened early this morning or last night. Authorities are investigating the Tesla Cybertruck explosion that occurred outside Trump Las Vegas Hotel Wednesday as a possible act of terror. Officials said at least 7 bystanders were injured in the explosion, and the driver who pulled the truck into the valet area of the hotel, I think he was killed. Investigators, however, determined that this is pretty interesting. Investigators did, however, determine that the Tesla truck was rented through the Turo app, the same app used to rent the pickup truck used in the New Orleans attack, law enforcement sources told the Post. Also, I've watched the video on that, of this Tesla truck exploding in front of the Trump Hotel. That truck was definitely loaded with fireworks, like the mortar type fireworks, because the video, there's 2 videos. One's from inside the hotel, where you just see like a big flash. It looks like the sun exploded. But there's a video from outside, and it looks like those mortars that you set off on the 4th of July. Well, my brother used to set off, and they're going everywhere, just popping. So I think this is a terrorist attack. Last week's story, we covered the illegal alien that set that poor woman on fire, and she burned to death, unfortunately. She's been identified. The sleeping subway passenger who was burned to death on a Brooklyn F train has been identified through fingerprints as 57-year-old Debrina Quam. From what I've read about this woman, she's led a hard life after graduating from high school. She fell on hard times, probably drug addiction. She was arrested for prostitution. Her last known address was in a homeless shelter in the Bronx. So probably a vagrant living on the train. It's unfortunate that this poor woman's life had to end this way. Again, she had a hard life. We'll keep following that story. And then speaking of the New York City subway, you can't make this stuff up. Last week after New York Governor Kathy Hochul and a security detail of 6'5" troopers proclaimed that the New York City subway was safe to ride, a Big Apple strap hanger was shoved onto a Manhattan subway tracks and struck by an incoming 1 train in a cowardly attack on Tuesday. Now, thank God the victim survived and there was an arrest made. But I've watched that video. You got these 2 teenagers. They jumped the turnstile, right? And they're kind of milling around the train station. And then you got a guy who's just kind of standing there playing on his phone. I mean, a split second before the train comes in, this other guy just comes out of nowhere, catches the guy between the shoulder blades and shoves him into the tracks, and the train goes right over this guy, and the guy lived. I guess he must have fell right in the well and banged his head a little bit, but they said he's expected to survive and be all right. Then you see the 2 teenagers who jumped the turnstile like, holy shit, we don't want any of this. They jumped the turnstile to get the hell out of there. Like I said, there was an arrest made. Now, the reason I made that comment about Kathy Hochul and her 6'5" state troopers, I know I'm going to catch shit for this, but I don't care. I worked a couple of cases with the New York State Police. They're very about appearance. And when we took down that case where we had those guys shipping those cars to Shanghai, we had a press conference. So the last people to arrive at the press conference was, I don't know the hierarchy of the New York State Police, but let's just say for argument's sake, he's the director of the New York State Police. We had to wait on this guy who had nothing to do with the case. Never saw the guy, was never in a meeting. He just he's like their police commissioner. He flew in on a private plane from Albany with 2 of the biggest state troopers I've ever seen in my life. Now, my sergeant at the time was 6'5", and these guys were much taller than him, and they were in their Smokey the Bear outfits with those Stetsons. And one guy had to be 6'7", the other guy had to be 6'9", and they stood on either side of this guy. So you've got the director of the New York State Police who had nothing to do with this case, and 2 bookends that stood on either side of them. So, I mean, I have nothing against the New York State Police, but it just was kind of showy for me. This is a sad story. A woman who was murdered by a group of men in Queens more than 3 decades ago has finally been identified through advanced DNA testing. Several months later, an unidentified body, 30 years ago, an unidentified woman's body was found hidden in a large wooded area with cord binding her ankles in a grassy area where the Cross Island Parkway and the Southern State meets. 4 men, including 2 20-year-olds and an 18 and 19-year-old, were arrested and charged the same year. This is in 1992. One pleaded guilty in September of 92 to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 8.5 to 25 years in jail. He was cut loose on parole, of course he was, then they discharged him in August of 2016, which means he was a good boy. The 2 others pled guilty in 1992 to first-degree reckless endangerment and was sentenced to 2 1/3 to 7 years in prison, the DA's office said. Both were released in 1996 and then discharged from parole in 1998. What's astonishing about these sweetheart sentences is you would expect this in the Bronx or Brooklyn. It was the Queens District Attorney's Office, and their DA, I think his name was Richard Brown, he was pretty good. I mean, this must have been a case that was very difficult to prosecute. Probably what happened is they didn't have much evidence, and they had one guy that was talking, so they probably were afraid to roll the dice on a trial and gave all these guys sweetheart deals, but they had a dead woman, and they had no idea who she was. And sadly now, 3 decades later, they've finally gotten to the bottom of this, but it's sad that no one knew who this woman was. I guess there was a missing persons report filed, and people say, well, why didn't they put 2 and 2 together? I had NYPD Sergeant and Missing Persons Sergeant John Fariso, who's written a good book, worked in the Missing Persons Unit, and you wouldn't believe the amount of missing persons reports that come in. I mean, back then, New York City was averaging between 2,000 and 2,500 homicides a year. So you can just imagine the amount of missing persons reports would probably quadruple that. So to kind of line that up, I'm not making excuses, but I'm sure it was very difficult. But at the very least, this woman's family has closure. So on the latest episode of Empire, ex-NYPD chief Jeffrey Madry's lawyer insists sex for overtime was consensual, and he's weighing a lawsuit against his accuser. The former chief of the department, who abruptly resigned 1 week ago as the sex for overtime scandal engulfed America's largest police department, stood silently with fists clenched next to his lawyer as he slapped down the scathing accusations. We can tell you those allegations are a lie. They are not true. We deny every aspect of them. Attorney Lambro told reporters. We can tell you that Lieutenant LaQuisha Epps, since October this year, has been under investigation by the Internal Affairs Bureau for overtime she's never completed. But wait, there's more. 2 more female cops close to disgraced NYPD Chief Jeff Madry, including his driver, raked in massive overtime and other perks, according to the Post. The chief's former driver made an eye-popping $163,414 in overtime last year and resigned days after the Post exposed her boss's conduct at police headquarters. What's crazy about this whole story is this female lieutenant kind of gave a press conference a week ago saying that, he kind of forced her into the situation. Now you've got the chief, he resigned, and now he's having press conferences. I guess both their representation is telling them to get out there and get ahead of this. Like I've always said, there's 3 sides to every story. There's what he said, there's what she said, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. But now what it looks like is it was a free-for-all with the overtime at one police plaza. So it depends on how deep they really want to go with this. They might just they don't want to feed the flames on it, so maybe this will just go away and you'll never hear another thing about it. If the feds get involved or the Manhattan District Attorney's Office really want to pursue this, they can lock people up for stealing from the city with overtime that these people never performed and put in for it. So with all these dark stories, I thought I would tell a funny one to ring in the new year. I hope I haven't told this story before, but most NYPD cops, unless you're a summons guy or a highway cop, don't like writing summonses because you're always going to fight with the person you're giving the summons to. You feel like a shithead doing it. And they force you to do it. Like I said, in a precinct, back in my time, you had to write a book of parking tickets, which are 25, 10 moving violations, and 3 they wanted red lights because those were the big ticket items. And, you're writing working people that, and people fight back. They're going to take these things to traffic court because these things are expensive. They get points on their license. Their insurance, God only knows what someone's insurance goes up to now if they get a ticket. But I remember people like, do you know what this is going to do to my insurance? And you feel bad for them. But if you don't write these summonses, they're going to mess with you. So inevitably, I don't know how other boroughs worked, but I can give you an insight of what the Bronx was like. So what would happen is, usually a couple of days before a traffic court date, maybe a week before, or sometimes you got notified the day before, your administrative lieutenant or one of his lackeys would hunt you down. And if you did 4 to 12s or midnights, it was a pain in the ass because traffic court was Monday to Friday, 8 to 4 probably. And you're working a 4 to 12, and your administrative lieutenant would hand you a piece of paper, and it would say TVB, which is Traffic Violations Bureau, case of, and there'd be a bunch of names and dates. And you're like, oh, Jesus. And they're like, it's tomorrow at 10 a.m. Now I'm doing a 4 to 12, which means now I got to work a 4 to 12, go home, get a couple hours sleep, do a tour change, and come back the next day at 7 a.m. And when you come back, you got to stand roll call in uniform. You're kind of like a visitor on the day tour shift. So they're not going to put you in a radio car. So usually what happens is they're going to put you on a foot post somewhere in the precinct, and you're expected to make your way through public transportation to traffic court and testify on these cases. So the old Bronx traffic court was in the middle of nowhere. It was on Sedgwick Avenue just before you got to Fordham Road. It was a long stretch that paralleled the Major Deegan Expressway. There's nothing around there. And it was this little building. And my precinct, the 50, wasn't far from it. I think it was actually in the 52, our sister precinct. So what would happen is they would usually give you a foot post somewhere on Sedgwick Avenue, and it was a hike, and you would make your way up there. And you had to bring your memo books, the things that cops write in, because after you write a moving violation, you're expected to write like a little story in your book what you observed. I was sitting at this light, the light was working before and after. There's a whole verbiage with a red light. Let's just say I wrote somebody a red light ticket. So you get there and you clock in, and then you wait in this room, and you're like, oh, you're in court. There's like 3 or 4 little bullshit courtrooms. It's almost like it looked like the people's court, but not as nice. So you're sitting in there, and there's cops from the Bronx, and the pain in the ass thing with these things are, you'd write somebody a red light ticket in 1988, and they were in jail or left the country, and they were gone for decades. I would get, like, in my last year as a detective, like in 2007, I was going to traffic court for tickets I wrote in 1988. Now, obviously, the guy knew he had a problem, but now he's decided to take care of it because they wait you out. They figure you're dead, you're retired. Because if the cop doesn't show up more than once or twice, there's a whole thing to it. If the cop doesn't show up a couple of times, they're supposed to dismiss it. But back then, I mean, I was going on things that were 15, almost 20 years old, right? And the whole thing is fixed, right? The judge isn't really a judge. He's like an administrative thing. They call him referees. And it's the funniest thing. They have like a quota. I'm speaking because this is the way it looks to me. I don't know this for a fact, but it's like guilty, 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 guilty. And then later in the day, they start letting people slide. And if the cop went up there, a lot of cops were like, I'm not, I don't want to be here. I'm pissed off at this. And let's just say for argument, a cop saw that, the guy shows up and the guy's got charts and stuff. And he realized I banged a decent guy. Some guys would come up with amnesia and go, I have no recollection of this case, which would piss off the judge. It would piss off everybody because the state wants their money. They want to find these people guilty because it's revenue for the state and the city. So then what they used to do is they would have IEB, Internal Affairs, sitting in the courtroom. And if you went in there and you claimed you didn't remember something, they would check your memo book, and then they give you a command discipline for either lying that you did have something in your memo book, or they give you a command discipline that you didn't write something in your memo book from 100 years ago. So anyway, in the Bronx, there was this guy. He was like a Geraldo Rivera clone, but he was short. He kind of looked like a cross between Geraldo Rivera and Che Guevara, right? He was a little guy, and he had like a beard, and he had like a Jewish first name and a Hispanic last name. It was like Harvey Diaz III or Harvey Quinones III. And what his deal was, he would represent the gypsy cab drivers. And in the Bronx, you got tons of these gypsy cabs. And for those of you that don't know, a gypsy cab is usually a 4-door car that cruises the bus stops or the train stations. They're like dollar cabs. They have no license, no registration, no insurance. If you get into an accident with one of these guys, you're screwed. And they would cruise these bus stops and train stations, and people would jump in and take me a couple of blocks if it was raining or something, and they would give them $1, $2, $3, $5, whatever they charge. So this guy spoke fluent Spanish. He was Hispanic, and he had this little rumpled suit, and you would see him in the hallway or the stairwells, and he had this deal. I don't know exactly how the deal worked, but he would represent these cab drivers, and he would charge them $100 if he won. If he lost, they didn't have to pay him anything. So like you'd hear like screaming in Spanish sometimes in the hallways, right? And this guy was such a showman. Like at first I used to think he was a pain in the ass. I didn't like him. Then I realized it's just an act. And he was so passionate. Like you would want this guy representing you if your life was on the line. Like if you were facing a murder charge, he would pound the podium. Like if the cop didn't have his notes in the book or the cop misspoke, he was like, oh, look at this, and pound the thing and putting on a show. I mean, he was actually quite entertaining. Like I said, I used to think he was a pain in the ass, but then I actually kind of thought he was funny. And a couple of times I caught him winking at the cops like, yeah, I know what I'm doing. So anyway, he was doing this. He popped up probably 93, 94. He had a good run. He was around pretty much through the 90s, and then he just kind of like vanished off the face of the earth. So I remember one time, like after my second or third time in a row in traffic court, I asked one of the female cops or one of the people that worked there, I go, what happened to Harvey Diaz III? I go, what did he die? And they go, oh, he's not allowed here no more. He kind of got disbarred. I go, disbarred? And she goes, well, he never really had a law license. I go, what are you talking about? She goes, well, he pissed off a couple of the judges there. Now, the referees, the judges who aren't really judges, they were attorneys to their credit. And I guess Harvey pissed them off that they started digging into Harvey's background and found out that Harvey didn't have a license to practice law. And this has happened before. There was a guy in the Bronx in actually criminal court, not Harvey, but another guy that got busted doing that. So basically, Harvey was banned from Bronx traffic court. And as much as I despised Bronx traffic court on Sedgwick Avenue, probably around the early 2000s, they moved it to Fordham Road and I think it's Southern Boulevard, where there was absolutely no parking. It was right next to a short stay motel. And it just, that was even worse because you always had to go there with your partner who would sit in the car and like circle the block. You couldn't just go there because there was absolutely no place to park. And when you're in a specialized unit, it's like not like they're going to put you on a foot post. So if I worked in auto crime and I was like, oh, I got to get down to traffic court, they expect you to be there. And if you didn't show up, like if you were notified that you had traffic court and you didn't show up, it was an instant command discipline. They didn't want to hear it. I had one time I was in the 90s, I was tracking a stolen car with LoJack. And I had traffic court. I looked at my sergeant, who was a great guy. He was a car guy. And I go, what do you want to do? He goes, don't worry about it. I'll get you out of this. Let's find the stolen car. So I think I got a search warrant, or I made an arrest with the LoJack tracking a stolen car, and I never went to traffic court. 2 months later, it's like, come here, and I get a notification to go see the commanding officer. I was getting a command discipline for failure to show up, right? So I walk in and he's like, you didn't go to, you weren't in traffic. And my sergeant wasn't working that day. So for him saying, yeah, I got your back, which he would have, but he just wasn't around that day. That was the day I had to stand tall before the man. So I walk in and he's like, I don't want to hear it. You didn't go to traffic court. You're getting a command discipline. I want 4 hours. And I'm like, boss, I said, I see where you're coming from, and I know they want blood. I says, but I just got you a search warrant and arrest, so we went back and forth, and he goes, all right, you're warned and admonished. So I didn't lose any vacation time. But hated traffic court. Any cops that are watching this, I'm sure it's even more. Back then everything was written on a slip of paper. Nowadays, and you got cops that are given department cell phones, the notification, they're probably screwed. So like you could pretend, oh, I never got that. I didn't sign for it. I remember one time they tried giving me a notification. I'll never forget this when I worked in Bronx Task Force on Sedgwick Avenue. And I remember there was this female cop there who worked in roll call. And whenever there was a notification, you couldn't say, well, you never saw me. Don't give this to me, right? She would like hunt you down. She would just like, nope. She would put it in her little memo book. I served, it was like a process server, right? And I remember one time I heard her going, where's Ferrari? He's got traffic court tomorrow. I'm like, oh shit. I ran down the 2 steps of the building and jumped over the stairs and took off running. And like right next door to the old 4-4 precinct was a gas station. Because I heard her pop out looking for me. She goes, Ferrari, was that you? I jumped out, I ran down the block, and I hid in the gas station. And the guy that owned the gas station was laughing. I was hiding in one of his bays for about 20 minutes until I figured she went away. And then I popped out and got in my car and went home and pretended like I never got the traffic court notification. Anyway, that's some stories of traffic court in the Bronx. I want to wish everyone a happy new year. And I want to thank everybody for supporting this podcast. I really do. I never aspired to be a podcast host. I never wanted anything to do with this. I got involved with this to promote my books. And now this thing is kind of taken on a life of its own. For the most part, it's 90% uplifting. People write me really nice notes. We like the podcast. You should talk about this. They're very encouraging. And then I get guys, I don't know if they're cops or not, why are you spilling all these things and blah, blah, blah. First off, I'm not naming any names. Second of all, a lot of things I talk about have been well publicized. They've been in the papers. Now, granted, they're decades old, but I'm not naming any names, and I'm not going to get anybody divorced or in more trouble than they already were. So if you're worried about that, I'm not doing that. But as always, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, especially our listeners in Oklahoma City, Schenectady, New York, Abbotsford, British Columbia, Irvington, New Jersey, Pasadena, California, and Folsom, California, home to FBI's most wanted fugitive Glenn Stewart Godwin from his escape from the Fulton prison on June 5th, 1987 by cutting a hole through the fence, and he escaped through a storm drain that emptied into the American River. For those of you that are listening to this, go look this guy up. It's a fascinating story. It was the Shawshank Redemption before the Shawshank. Only thing is this guy totally did it. He was a ruthless killer. He escaped, and while he was on the FBI's most wanted list, a couple of years later, this guy gets caught for drug dealing in Mexico. So he's in a Mexican prison, and the United States finds out he's there, and they put a detainer on him. So now he's going to be extradited for the murder and prison escape that he pulled in California and brought back to the United States. So he hooks up with a Mexican gang in prison and kills a guy, stabs a guy to death. So then Mexico will charge him with the murder. Now he's not going anywhere. They probably whooped his ass in there. But then he escaped. So killing somebody in the Mexican prison, he curried favor with a gang in there, and they protected him, and then he escaped again. He's been on the run ever since 1987. I remember watching an episode of Unsolved Mysteries before Robert Stack went off the rails and started talking about ghosts, and I just looked it up. He's still a wanted person. The ironic thing is, his cellmate or one of his friends in prison that got out helped him escape, and then after he escapes, his friend goes to jail and then commits suicide in jail. His ex-wife was involved in the escape. They hunted her down. She did a couple of years in jail. So Glenn Scott Goodwin, I hope you get caught. If you work in law enforcement or have an interesting criminal background, please drop me a note on Twitter or Instagram if you'd like to be a guest on the show. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like and subscribe button. And if you enjoy the content, go to my Amazon author page, type in my name, Vic, for I Like the Car, where you can preview all my NYPD books for free, including NYPD Presumption and Dysfunction. I'm going to try to get a guest for next week, and hope everyone has a safe weekend, and I'll see you guys next week. Take care.